Yeah, from a seniors perspective, we don't go all out as such. We wouldn't have all of the bells and whistles that an NBA side has. We've effectively got a doc, a physio, potentially a sports therapist as well, and an S&C coach. We've got other members of the SSM team that we could probably tap into, psychologist, nutritionist, player welfare officer. I think that's something that most people would say would be a really useful addition to the SSM team. But at senior level, given our short camps that we've got, this is sort of the bare bones that we work with. And from a club perspective, these aren't sort of too unfamiliar, hopefully, to most of you. What I would say to you is if you've got a sports doc on side, a doctor on side, I would definitely push you towards having a sports medicine doctor. A lot of what a sports medicine doctor do is an extension of a GP practice, but it's a bit more sports orientated. That might mean if, for instance, you've got a player that's sort of saying to you, well, I've been fatigued for like 3 or 4 weeks, I just don't know what it is, I just can't quite get to grips with why I'm so tired. A sports medicine doctor might choose a certain different set of blood tests to a normal GP, for instance. So they were looking at maybe some chronic fatigue symptoms or signs within the bloods that might lead you to a sports-specific reason for this. They also might have a better idea of what sort of imaging you might need if there's a request for an ankle X-ray or an MRI scan or something like that. From a physiotherapist standpoint, there is a bit of contention here. I'm a chartered physiotherapist. I did 3 years at university to become a chartered physio. We are regulated by something called the Health Council, Healthcare and Professions Council, and the HCPC makes sure that every 2 years about a third of us get hauled up before them, and we have to present data to say that we are continuing our professional development. Our title is what they call a protected title. It's like calling yourself a chartered accountant. If you don't do your chartership, you can't call yourself a chartered accountant. We're allowed to call ourselves a physiotherapist, but no other profession should be able to. Most sports therapists don't call themselves physiotherapists, but there is a bit of this crossover here. Sports therapists, there are 2 main avenues really. There's a Society of Sports Therapists, and then there's the Association of Sports Therapists, I think it is. The Society of Sports Therapists, they regulate their sports therapists every couple of years in the same way that the HCPC does for physios. Therefore, there is an underlining standard that they all recruit to. The other organisation don't really do that, and therefore you might find a discrepancy in the quality of your sports therapists. Don't get me wrong, there are some amazing sports therapists out there, but sometimes there might be this discrepancy. Physiotherapists, when they do their training, will do a large amount of training within respiratory and neurology, so not just muscles and bones, they'll also look at the heart and lung functions, head injury rehab, things like that. And in a sporting context, whilst that might not be immediately irrelevant, if you're away with a team in Bulgaria, for argument's sake, someone has an asthma attack, the likelihood is that a physiotherapist might have a better understanding of how to deal with that situation than a sports therapist does, who potentially hasn't touched any of that respiratory stuff in their training. Does that kind of make some sense? Within Basketball England and GB, we will ask sports therapists and physios to go with teams. We haven't got a problem with that. But what we do insist that they have all done trauma management course. So a sports first aid course which is dealing with trauma management, i.e. not just can I put a plaster on someone or can I pop them in a sling, which maybe some sports first aid courses are. It's can they deal with that individual that has a sudden collapse on the pitch and there might be some sort of cardiac issue going on there? Are they able to take care of a suspected spinal injury and, as Dane was alluding to, be able to manage concussions in a really, really good way? So sports trauma management is what we would ask for at our end. When it comes to S&C coaches, we've probably all been to the local gym and seen personal trainers there, some of which are excellent, but as a personal trainer you can build up your experience level by doing a couple of weekend courses. All the S&C coaches that work for us have done a master's normally in strength and conditioning, and we ask that they are UK SCA registered, i.e. UK Strength and Conditioning Association registered, and if they're not, then at least they should be working their way towards it. And to become UK SCA registered, you have to do a number of qualifications along that route. And that just gives us a baseline standard at which we can say all of our staff are able to work to that level. Does that make some sense? I see the SSM team as being massively part of the coaching team, and I really do advocate having this very close dialogue between the coaching staff and the SSM team. And in essence, I really don't see there being two separate organisations. When I first started with the seniors, the previous performance director, Warwick Cann, used to say that actually he felt that the head coach of the senior men or senior women, in sort of ranking terms, would be alongside of the head coach, the head of sports science and medicine, so that there should be this sort of synergy between the sports science and medicine team and the coaching staff. I don't know whether you guys agree with that. But in terms of being able to provide a performance level to the players, I think that could well hold true. What do you reckon?
I agree with that. I
Yeah?
agree with that quite strongly. I think I've always said this to our players, like, they can play without me because there's a ball, there's 5 of them. If one of them gets injured, they can't play without the physio, for example.
And
I agree wholeheartedly. I think we should be working more in sync, and I don't know if that, I think there is a gap in the disparity, probably, if we're being honest with ourselves.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that doesn't necessarily just relate to elite end. I think we can do this at a club level, and I really do think that if there's the time to be able to sit down as coaches with your sports science and medicine team, even if it's just one physio who turns up once a week for the games, then you must be able to have that dialogue to say, well, this player, they've got a bit of a dodgy ankle. Can we play him or her? Can we get them back on court quicker? And actually, when we do get them back on court, what do they need to do on court? Because from my perspective, I don't know what you as coaches are going to ask that player to do. So it's well worth having a really good dialogue there. Like I said, I really see our sort of performance team being everyone in together. But from an SSM perspective, what we can provide you guys with is hopefully healthier players, and we tend to do an awful lot of this stuff. We're going to go into some of these things so that I can give you a little bit of education, especially around loading and wellness, which is one of those sort of controversial topics that people always come up with. But from our perspective, we try to do a lot of screening early on, whether that's early on in the season or early on in the camp, so that at least we've got a baseline at which to work off. And when we're looking at screening, there are multiple tests that we can do, and we should be able to try and make them as sport specific as possible. But one of the main reasons we're doing these tests is to get a baseline to say, well, actually, that hamstring on that player, their right hamstring is 10%, 20%, 30% stronger than the left side. So does that mean that that left side is at a potential risk of an injury through there? And if we've got the whole of the season to work on that, then we should be trying to identify that at the start of the season so that we can then put a program in place to make sure that we reduce that risk of injury to that hamstring, for instance. I think that we can link in our testing with what you guys are wanting as well. So we know, myself and Ness know that Chema is massively pushing towards this fast break sort of scenario. We've got some fast players on the court pitch. I know if I know that that's Chema's goal, then maybe I can design a test that might be able to say, well, actually, this player's 0 to 5 metre sprint is really good, but in comparison with her colleague who plays the same position, that's not quite as good. So can we put a program in place for the second player that might be able to get her back up to speed? And overall, that's going to help the performance of our squad. It does take a bit of time, and in short camps where especially the sort of international windows that we've got for the age group stuff or the senior stuff at the moment, it's tricky, and we've massively reduced what we do in terms of screening. For the senior women, we've literally probably got a handful, 5 or 6 little tests that we do every time they come in. But one thing I would like to say to you is that from a medical perspective, so Dane's bit, we need to screen these players at least once a year. And what we're screening them in a medical sense is, have they got any cardiorespiratory issues, coughs, colds? And in our cohort of players, we need to be really sure that they don't, especially adolescents, have any heart problems. We have a high number of Black Afro-Caribbean players, and the incidences of sudden cardiac death in that cohort of players is really high. We cannot screen 100% on court and say this player is 100% able to go on court and this risk is 0. However, if before that player comes into camp, we do a little, even just the old stethoscope listening to the heart, a skilled doctor will be able to say this player potentially has a murmur or not, and then we can take that player out and ask him or her to go and do further tests in a controlled environment. If we don't do that and that player collapses on the court later on down the line, and we've got a big problem on our hands. That's not to say that that doesn't happen. If we look at Fabrice Maramba, who collapsed on the pitch for Tottenham, Premiership player, all bells and whistles given to him, echocardiograms, cardiac specialists looking at him, and he still collapses, and he's very, very fortunate to be alive at the moment. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to say. Like, we will medically screen every player at least once a season, and that's the way that we're looking at it from now on. But it does take a bit of time. I appreciate that. This is one of the areas that is really tricky, but load management is quite tough. And this is for those of you that don't know him, this is Mark Williams. He's our head of S&C at the BBF, and it's something that at the elite end, we can probably cope with load relatively well. At a junior level, we can probably cope with load very well, but we don't know what that effect will have on the kids going forward. So what do we mean by load? Well, effectively, it's any sort of physical or mental stress that's placed on the body. Training is a stimulus. We need the training to be able to perform. If we're not training, then we're never going to be able to perform at the level that we're asking these kids to play at. But we need a balance between training and then the load that we're putting these guys and girls under. We want to monitor the load because we know that if we're exposing these players to a heck of a lot of load, then their injury risk goes through the roof. We want to make sure that we've got as many top level players on the court for as many minutes as we can throughout the season. And actually, by measuring load, we can then, for argument's sake, we can say, well, that player is potentially fitter than he or she was at the start of the season or at the start of pre-season, and that's because we can test the load over a number of weeks, months, etc. By adapting load, we will probably get some changes in physical development and fundamental movement patterns without exposing them to a higher injury risk. But we don't talk about load management from a perspective of stopping people from training. It's about maybe training smartly and not just saying, right, well, actually, we're going to do 12 suicides up and down the court as part of a punishment because the squad haven't been performing as they should have done. That to me is an example of load that potentially players don't need to be exposed to. So is it smart training? I don't know. We're looking to obviously optimise our training as much as we can because we need to get this dose-response relationship going. We'll come on to that in a second. Understanding the current athlete's capacity is useful because if we can say, well, actually this athlete is able to tolerate 2,000 units of load per week. Unit is an arbitrary number, but if that athlete can tolerate 2,000 units in 1 week, but this athlete can tolerate 4,500 units in 1 week, we've got a bit of discrepancy as to how much those individuals will be able to train per week, because we know that if we increase load by about over 12 to 15% per week, then their injury rate goes up. I'll come on to that in a bit, but it doesn't take an awful lot to push an athlete over that little threshold, and we go them into the injury risk area. So whatever we do to the body, we need to allow the body to adapt. Our first thing that happens after training, or during training, sorry, we've got a negative output of energy, and then we have an impact to the joints, muscles, bones, etc., etc. Without the adequate recovery from that, then this negative output carries on going, and we get these overloads. And this is a nice example of a really swollen, inflamed Achilles, courtesy of an overload to that individual, and it hasn't been allowed to recover. So the response to the input is that somewhere along the line something's broken. We need time during after recovery to allow adaptation. So if we go to the gym, we're going to do loads and loads of bicep curls. We need that time to allow that bicep to then grow over time. And if we take another stimulus of bicep curls within too short a period of time, then potentially that's going to actually have a negative effect on our response to that. Does that make some sense? Basically, our biceps going to get sore. Might be fine for our biceps, but actually if we're looking at tendons, patella tendon for instance, and we don't give it enough time to recover, then potentially we're going to inflame those. And it's a difficult tightrope to get. If we're not giving ourselves recovery time, then we might well tip you over into that overuse injury. But secondly, if our recovery length of time is too much, then actually we lose that stimulus. So let's say we do our bicep curls on a Sunday, and then we don't do them again for another 2 weeks. Actually, we probably haven't gained anything from that original set of bicep curls that we did. So from your perspective, it'll be a case of, well, if we train well on a Monday, have we given them sufficient amount of time to recover before we then train again on the Tuesday? Or does our level of training on the Tuesday have to be slightly adapted compared to the level of training on that Monday, so that we're not tipping them into this overuse sort of area, an injury risk area, should we say. And actually tiring athletes out is completely normal, and it's what we need. We need to give a stimulus to the body that allows adaptation to those muscles, tendons, ligaments. If we don't do that, then we're never going to actually improve in a physical standpoint. So it's completely fine to push people in a training setting as long as we've got that adequate recovery time afterwards. This is something that I think when you're working with adolescents, this is something that we really need to be aware of. We've all heard of those athletes that have turned away from the sport because they've lost the love of the sport. I think that's quite a relatively common phrase. There is something called overtraining syndrome. It potentially comes under the banner of chronic fatigue. And for those, especially adolescents, that we potentially see in this environment where they're playing, I don't know, for argument's sake, GB under 16s, having come off the back of a really good college season, they go and play GB under 16s, and then they go over to the US and get beaten in the US, and then they come back next summer and they're just like, guys, I don't really feel like playing for GB this summer. We have to delve into some of the reasons why that might be the case, but sometimes this could be something in there. Now, it might not manifest itself physically. It might not be that we've got a massively inflamed patella tendon and we're seeing that as an issue to pull them out. It could be that they're just mentally fatigued with the basketball. And there isn't, unfortunately, a definitive blood test that you can say, well, actually, this is the cause of it. There are some differences to blood tests, and you might be able to say between normal blood tests and this person that you're suspecting has got an overtraining syndrome, there might be some slight differences, but this is where a really good sports medicine doctor comes in to play, and he or she might be able to say, well, actually, the blood tests along with some of the questioning I'm asking them might lead us to think that this player's got some overtraining. And we had it with, in my last job at Gloucester Rugby, we had it with an under 18 very, very good rugby player, and we just pulled him out of playing any sport. He did what he wanted to do for 6 months, and now he's getting international call-ups at senior levels. That was a few years ago, but honestly, he was in a bad place at that time. And I do worry about some of these players that we just lose to the ether, whether this is part of it, if you see what I mean. There's no rule book for loading. Some players will be able to tolerate some loads really well, other players won't. I won't name names, but there's one of our senior girls who will massively be able to perform to 4,000-5,000 units of load a week, no problem. She's an older player and she copes with it brilliantly. There's another older player, I should say, but younger than this one, who, if we pushed her anywhere near 3,500 units a week, that would be bad news. She wouldn't be on court. We'll come on to units in a bit, but we need to be really specific with our training. In a team environment, that's tricky. I very much appreciate that you want to train as a squad the whole time, but actually we might need to tailor what we do outside of team training a little bit so that we're not overloading these athletes for certain athletes. Equally, you might be able to push those ones that can tolerate better load. This was quite an interesting stat. So this was 2017, 2018 season. And this is just taking two WBBL teams and comparing their weekly loads. And look at these differences. And I've only put that on there because I won't tell you who the teams are, but you know, if we've got a player coming into national teams camp and one player is used to this sort of loading, but another player is used to this sort of loading, how do we turn around to the coach and say this is how much these players are going to tolerate? Because if we push this player that's used to this loading up to this level, they're going to break. Equally, if we spend 3 or 4 weeks training at a level like this player here is probably going to relatively decondition compared to what he or she is used to. And this is quite a tricky balance to get. This is just some of the challenges. There's no right or wrong to this. It's just, if this is what we're seeing at a domestic level, when that translates into a national teams level, it's one of those things that's quite tricky to understand. So we can monitor load in different ways. We've got the fancy stuff that you see in football and rugby, for instance. Believe it or not, we used to have these in the good old days when we had some money at the top end. But we actually didn't use it. We didn't use it probably as well as we should do, because the data that comes out of these catapult systems is quite tricky to disseminate. And unless you're really honing in on exactly what you want out of it, it's kind of like, well, yeah, great, we've got these little things, we're running around with them on our back. And the data is massive. So you often need a sports scientist, someone that's used to looking at this time and time again, day in, day out, to be able to get these sort of things. But effectively, we've got internal monitoring systems and then external monitoring systems. Internal, you can't really change the data on this. This says exactly what it says on the tin, and there's no way you can sort of get around that. External monitoring, we can have psychological aspects to this. If I put a chocolate bar on the floor by those balls and myself and Chris were going to go and run to them, we might make it there a little bit quicker because the first one that's going to get there is going to get a chocolate bar. But if I told Chris, oh, mate, just sprint over to those balls, the input and his impetus to get there might be different if there wasn't that chocolate bar there. Fair enough? So we can have psychological changes to this, and GPS and accelerometers data again there are psychological inputs or changes that we can make with those just by language as a starting aspect. This is one of the simplest ways that we use consistently, and whether you can do this on a day-to-day basis at your club level is difficult to know. I know definitely they do them at the dice colleges. I would expect most national teams to be able to do this on a very simple level. And what we use is this rate of perceived exertion, RPE, which is just a question that we give to the players. Here's our RPE scale here. It's just a Borg scale, and we just ask the players, how did you find that session? Was it dead easy, or was it really hard? And I think what we all need to sort of be aware is that we can create our unit of load by using our RPE, and we just times it by the duration of the session in minutes. So if we've got a 60-minute session, we can ask the player, how was that? And that player might turn around and say, Yeah, that was a 5 out of 10.
Yeah, I think RPs and everything is great. The only thing I've found is, especially if it's all on one sheet, like if you're asking players all the same, whatever the person puts at the top, everyone always puts between plus or minus 1 of that thing.
Well, I think worth. So session RPE is really, really useful, and I think it's a really good educational tool for the players and an educational tool for the coach. So I could turn around to you and say, right, you've scheduled a 2-hour training session coming up. What is your RPE for this? And you'll look at your plan and you might go, do you know what? I think this is going to be a 6 out of 10. So I go, all right, 6 out of 10 for 2 hours, 120 minutes. That's going to be a fair amount of load, but then after the session, I could turn around to you and go, all right, in retrospect, now looking at it again, what do you think that session was? And you might go, well, actually, they didn't really push themselves as hard as I thought they would do. I think it's more of a 4 out of 10. I'll go, fine, 4 out of 10. And then we ask the players, and the players might turn around and go, do you know what? On average, we've said that's an 8 out of 10. And then I can turn around to you and go, do you know what? The players have said it's 8 out of 10. In which case, you might have to reflect back on your training session and go, well, actually, yeah, maybe I did push them a bit harder there, or I didn't push them as hard there, and so on and so forth. But you're exactly right. If I place a sheet of paper here and ask the whole squad to walk past it, they'll look at what their mates put and gone, well, if I found that really hard and my mates put a 5 there, I'm thinking I'm blowing out my bum and it's an 8 out of 10, I'm going to put a 6. And that, I completely get that. And so having either, I appreciate staff members and stuff like that, it's not always easy. Either I take you as a player away from everyone else, ask you what it was and you gave it to me, or we are currently using an online app where we just go, right, players, put your RPEs on the online app. We manipulate the minutes. That's also important, because we don't want a player to sort of turn around and go, well, actually, I was doing a rehab session on the side for 10 minutes. I stood around for another 10 minutes, so I must have only been working for 10 minutes. We try to standardise it across the whole squad so that everyone's giving us the same data. And then we get those numbers out, and we can see what a squad average looks like. But importantly, we can also see what an individual's average looks like over time. So if the squad average is 6, for instance, I know that there are a couple of players in the senior women that will tend to put higher than some of their colleagues, and that's completely fine. That is it's not a problem. It's just going to give us a little bit of difference in the data set at the end of the week. Does that kind of make sense? Everyone happy with that? But I definitely think if you guys as coaches know that this data is being collected, it could well be very interesting from your perspective to go, so what was that? No, feel free. So as I mentioned earlier, once we get this data back in, we can then look at our loading over time. I'll skip through this pretty rapidly. This is our plan for the Commonwealth Games last year. Green is training sessions, orange is a lift, you can just about see orange, red's a game, yellow's a recovery. So this was our plan going into a month's worth of training over in Oz, and this is what we sort of came up with. This is the plan. When we collect it from individuals, we sort of can collect it into this sort of type of data, and we might say, here's our recovery session. It lasted 40 minutes long and they felt it was a 1 out of 10. That's fine. At the end of the week, we'll be able to collate all of these units of load up, and then we know for this individual that he or she was able to comfortably cope with 3,338 units of load. That's what it would look like in real time. Again, we can put it into spreadsheets and we can easily manipulate it from there, or transpose it, I should say, from there. And then this at the Commonwealth Games, this is exactly what happened. So we've got the recorded load in red, and then we've got, the recommended load in red, going back to our plan, and then the yellow is the actual load. The blue ones over here are the games at the end of the tournament, or the end of the sessions. And you can see there's pretty big discrepancies in it. We all know that you turn up to somewhere and you can't get access to a court for an hour for some reason, and therefore your training session's cut by half. All of these sort of things have an effect. But what we want to be able to do is look back and say, well, actually our average load we've been able to cope with is within our constraints, and we're happy with that. Does that make sense? Any sort of questions on that? Brian's looking at me going, we need to go to lunch.
Got questions now?
Huh?
Any questions?
Well, it's just on that bit.
Well, I've got one. There's coaches around here are dealing with, very few are dealing with this, right, every day, but lots of people are dealing with kids have 2 sessions a week or blah, 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 and they're doing school and they're doing everything. So what responsibility would you suggest for most National League coaches would be the minimum of knowledge for everyone to walk out of here with? You should know the load of your players within, or you should be able to do something to understand their journey. Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a tricky, really tricky question, because you as club coaches, for instance, you're going to get them for, I don't know, for argument's sake, 6 hours a week, but they've got another load of hours that they'll be doing at school. They'll be doing another load of hours just going off to a court and having a shoot. And how we manage that is really, really tricky. So this is one of Alan's players actually, as in a GB under 18 player. This was his summer. So he's played the whole season. Then he's come into a GB under 18 campaign on the back of the Basketball Without Borders, NBA Academy. I know that there's a time period between this Charnwood camp and the European Champs. It was about 4 days, so we had about 4 days rest there. And then he's done Europeans, then the Deng, then he's done the Future Star Tournament, and then he's going to go straight into his pre-season with his club. And so even at a pro footballer level, you potentially wouldn't have that amount of load going through that individual. Now, what I've spoken about before was a weekly load. And over a period of weeks, and we have nominated, you can nominate, normally most people nominate 4 or 6 weeks, but we can see what your chronic load is. So you basically take your weekly load over 4 weeks, divide it by 4, and you come up with your average. So if I go back a couple of slides, what we would probably want to see is just our average load, chronic load, over a period of 12 months steadily is able to go up without any injuries or anything like that. Because we could say that if our player is used to 3,000 units of load in September, we could argue that by Christmas they're used to 3,500 units of load, then their fitness has gone up. So their general robustness, able to play more often, be able to put more into each training session goes up. That's brilliant, as long as we don't go up through this line and have big spikes. So we don't want to do a 3,500 unit load week one week and then 5,000 the next week without a recovery period. So I think what you're saying, I'm trying to bastardize it a little bit, but how do we know that this player is going to do Monday, Tuesday training with club, do nothing on a Wednesday? We don't know this. So then how does it come down? Whose responsibility is, how do we monitor it? How do we say, well, this player's coming to us on a Monday and Tuesday, but he seemed absolutely shattered from the weekend. Well, what have you done over the weekend, mate? Well, actually, I played football on Saturday, I had a basketball game in the evening, and then I played, I don't know, rugby on the Sunday, for instance, and then I'm coming into 4 hours of training on Monday and Tuesday. It's really tricky. It's really tricky because as clubs, you're not controlling those players. As national team, we're not controlling those players. Who has ultimate responsibility? And I don't know whether any of us can answer that entirely. Maybe this is where this comes in. And having parents that kind of understand this, and I should say this cohort here, if they understand it and they understand they need adequate rest and recovery, then they're going to be able to manage it better. I know, I used to work with a guy who used to play rugby for England, and he has now become a player mentor for young rugby players. And he's basically situated himself with his big size 12s in between players, parents, schools, clubs. And he said, I will look at your training session, I will look at your load, and I will say to the school, why is that my budding rugby player who's got a sort of semi-professional contract with a Premiership club, why is the school asking him to do a cross-country race on a Thursday afternoon? You know, that's not going to help my player. So he's happy to be that conduit between saying to the player, yeah, you might want to do that cross-country race, but why are you doing it? And we're not going to allow you to do that. And then the parent who's saying, well, you know, shouldn't little Johnny do this cross-country race? And like, no, because it's not going to help his rugby. He's happy to do that. Now, as club coaches, you probably don't have the time to do that, and I get that. But it's just an idea that maybe if there is someone out there or an individual that has these contacts with players, maybe that's something that they might be able to think about.
Andy, I would just say, look, just in terms of the question that Matt asked, I think for me, and the kind of message I would try to get to our club coaches is the bare minimum really is just having an awareness that this is actually a thing. Yeah. That's kind of almost a starting process. Yeah. And I think where possible then having those discussions with parents and schools and the players, and just trying to create a situation where first of all coaches are actually aware of it and actually pay attention to how players look and how they feel and how they're performing and those kind of things, and also making sure that it's open enough for the players. Like I'll try to make a point of every day when we have practice, like when they're warming up or like how a guy's feeling, just little things like that. I think it's just asking the questions and being aware that it's something that they actually have to think about. I think that's almost like the bare minimum, because there's a lot of things that we probably do instinctively. If your guys are looking tired or you know they've had a lot, and you know you probably do, some of us probably do make those adjustments. And I think it's just making sure that's as a mindset, because I agree if you're coaching on the 14s on a Tuesday night and you don't see them again for the rest of the time, it's really, really difficult. But I think just coaches having that awareness that this is actually a thing that they should have in the back of their mind somewhere.
I think as well, from a club coach perspective, if you're this player's club coach and you know that since the last time you saw them at the end of the season, this is what they've done over the summer, and you compare that individual to another club player, that other club player might have had 3 or 4 months off, where there's arguments to say that's too long, but they've had a decent amount of rest time. As a club coach, you might have to go, do you know what, in pre-season we're going to cut this player a little bit of slack to allow him to recover a little bit. There's no right or wrongs as to how long that should be, but you might just sort of turn around and say, well actually this player, when the others are doing their conditioning and they're running up and down court, for instance, we might just allow this player to sit out, or actually we turn around to them and say, look, don't turn up to training today, you just need to rest up and you need to put your feet up. But there's a bit about education around the player, and it's not particularly difficult as a player, potentially, to gather this data as well. Whether you want to is another matter, but you know, as a player there might be a way of looking at your own loading that way as well.
So will you send a list of recommendations? Can we format a list of recommendations for players, parents, age group, or whatever?
Yeah.
Can do post this.
What we are gonna do, we hope, is use the membership portal to put up information like this, so that you can, should be able to sort of gather this from there. But I'm more than happy if you want to. I can disseminate these slides to Brian and they pass them on.
Andy, I've got a question. Flip side. I'm from the older generation. I'm not one to go against science. But just say, for instance, in the States, do you think that they follow these protocols about loading?
I think they talk about it.
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering, because I know that players are playing a full season, AAU, and then they probably continue training all the way through.
Yeah.
It's like the high performance players. So why all of a sudden, it's like a nanny state to me, is that we're so concerned. We should be, I understand, but there's a point where players have to be pushed.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying that training isn't a bad thing, but I think we need to train smart as well. And if we don't allow that recovery period, we know that players will get these tendon problems. And what I want to be able to say at sort of under 20s, potentially under 18s, and certainly into seniors, is that we're getting less players coming in with patellar tendinopathies, for instance. We've got 2/3 of our senior squads with patellar tendinopathies, and that is really historical. That isn't, we've gone into a European champs and player A has played too many minutes in European champs. That's not that. Player A probably played too many minutes in the European champs, that's a given. But they would normally recover from that. But what we're seeing is that player A plays too many minutes in the champs, and then they go and do all this other stuff, and the tendons never get a chance to recover. And over time, the quality of the tendon, i.e. the tissue in there, degenerates, and then that later on, and it doesn't necessarily be there and then, it could be 2 or 3 years, maybe even longer down the line, that player's tendon flares up, and then they're out for X amount of time, and they've got chronic pain and stuff like that. And you sort of look at our senior men and women, and it's really simple. We do this as a very simple assessment tool. It's really it really replicates what they kind of do on court. It's that little setting yourself before you shoot. Honestly, some of these senior players, even before they've got on court, can hardly bend their knee, and you're just like, how is this a pro athlete? And I completely get it. We need to push them, but we can use science in such a way to say, can we push them this far and keep pushing them? Or do we need to use a bit of the science to say, well, actually, we're going to push them too hard, and then we get these issues coming up. that might be the case. Yeah, and I think the way that I can sort of argue that I think it is working a little bit is that by the end of the Eurobasket this summer, our girls hardly had any tendon issues. Now, whether that's because prior to the tournament we'd managed them a bit better, there are, the starting five, for instance, that are going to play more minutes than the others. But if those key players don't end up with a tendon flare up at that point, I think we've done an okay job. And we've got such short spaces of time, we're not going to go into camp and push those players to improve their fitness. We need to get them playing basketball and doing, the detail, as I say it. But it's a tricky balance to get.
Do you link the number of units with their stats in the games? So what they're actually achieving on court when they're playing do you have some kind of spreadsheet where you link what training they've done in that month with the stats they're achieving to try and find their optimum units for that player? Because every individual player, it seems, has obviously got an optimum number of units. I'm guessing you're trying to get them to. Exactly, and that's why standardising the way you collect the units is going to be key. And the DICE colleges are pretty good at this. They'll be able to collect all those that data throughout the season, and then you can turn around to come into like a national teams camp and go, yeah, this is the amount that this individual is able to cope with. The problem comes with the collection of the data. Yeah. Is it standardised? Are we doing it the same across the board? It's not always the case. I would imagine it's easier at the level you're dealing, the higher level, because their players are used to it. Whereas it's kids at school and the lower level, which I deal with, and as Matt was alluding to, you're going to be playing basketball for say 20% of the week, and then the other physical activity throughout the week is completely unbasketball related. And sometimes the kids just don't get it. They don't get that there is going to be load if they go out on the playground at lunchtime and play a bit of footy. It's still load at the end of the day. And actually, from an overuse syndrome issue, we know that cognitive load can be pushing that individual over the edge. So physically, they might be pushing themselves to the edge anyway, and then you add in A-levels or some other college exams or something, and it tips them over. Do you know what I mean? So there's a cognitive element to it.
I'm glad you said the cognitive, because that's what I was going to comment on. I think that sometimes is a bigger issue than the physical, though. But I don't know if it's a different conversation for another time. But what I want to ask you is, are you aware of any other sports? So you talked about, you showed an example of a player that we had this summer that had a high load, let's say, during the summer between all the things he was involved in. Do you have an example from another sport, or do you know of how that's monitored or guided, or other than from the parents or the coach of that player, to say this is what you should be doing? Is there an example from another sport where the federation kind of says, actually this is what you're going to do for this period of time, because he's a talented player and he's on the pathway, whatever may be the case?
No, I don't, because most other sport, if you take rugby as an example, these top players are within the academy, and the academies, same with football, they hold on to them very tightly, and they won't necessarily allow them to play rugby or football for the school, for instance. So the school is there for their academic side of things, and the physical side of stuff is taken care of by the clubs. Hockey could be the closest example that we might be able to allude to, where we've got a number of players playing different clubs and they haven't got maybe a tangible hold on it. Hockey have a full-time S&C coach that is only dedicated to the youngsters, basically 23s and belows, and so he or she will liaise with schools, colleges, individuals around the loading work. We haven't got that yet, but there is no sort of, this is how much you should do, this is how much you can tolerate, these are the tournaments you can play. There isn't that, and I think it's difficult, because if we go back to that example, all of these days, that's not, you could argue that's not relatively over a course of 3 months, that's not a huge amount of basketball. But when you add in 13,000 miles of travelling, then we start saying, well, actually, that is a secondary load. It's not a load physically necessarily, but it's the travel stuff, and that adds another element to it. And also these are all relatively high level, and maybe at some point we're going to have to say, well, actually, you can do some of this, but you might, as an individual, want to pick and choose which ones you do. And obviously, with my BBF hat on, we want them to play under 18s, but maybe for the player, they're saying, well, actually, I need to get to that NBA academy. There's no right or wrong, is there, I suppose?
Just one more follow-up question, please. I've got my national team head coach hat on, so from the DICE perspective, the information I should be receiving, because that's why I just picked up on what you said a moment ago, I should be receiving information from DICE academies that this is the loading this player has per week. If that's that's where we're going. That's what should be happening. That's where we're going.
That's where we're going. Yeah, definitely.
But Andy, can I just link with Alan, and I don't know as much of the voice that, but why do our girls players, because I've been involved in the underage, seem less physically robust, physically prepared than a lot of the other European female players?
I think that.
What do you think from the male side of it?
About
players being physically robust, physically prepared, other countries seem to have younger players who were much higher fitness levels, physically more robust, but dealing. And obviously it's got to link to this.
Yeah,
massive difference.
Yeah, I think on the boys' side as well, we're not as physical as we think we are, or they think we are either. And I think it's a deeper, longer conversation. It's kind of a rabbit hole, isn't it? Because you're talking about if you go to Spain, for example, and just walk around the clubs in a local club in a small village, or Barcelona, a 10-year-old first visits a practice session about of S&C, balance, agility, coordination.
And that comes back to what Matt's saying about what's
belts
happening in the clubs, because that has an impact on 12-year-old people.
And then from a girl's perspective, girls don't want to be seen in the gym, and if they do, it's sort of. There's a bit of a wider discussion around what girls perceive as strength and conditioning coaches, and the fact that if I go and lift a couple of weights, I'm going to look like a man, for instance. That's something that often comes up, and so there's a lot of education that needs to go into that sort of thing.
As coaches, you're saying to parents you should be taking your son daughters doing other things.
Yeah.
Physically, endless times you go into Europe and these girls, particularly, are so much more robust.
Yeah.
Physically fit.
I agree. I think there is an element in terms of the SC stuff from work within practice, but I would, and this is just me guessing, I would guess that when at the higher end, when the girls move into a national team setup, their spike from compared to their general load is much bigger than the boys. Because I think across the girls' side, actually, I think what you probably find is more of the girls that don't play as much the rest of the time. If they have 2 practices a week or whatever, I think you probably get more boys that play more often. So when they come into an environment where suddenly that load is greater, because for them it's a bigger spike compared to their general chronic loading, they just break down a lot quicker, don't they? But I think physicality is different to being physically robust, if that makes sense. I think it's a bit of both, in the sense that actually in terms of physical, are we talking about physical style of play, or are we talking about them? Are we talking about them?
Yeah.
Are we talking about them breaking down? If that makes sense.
About being physically fit, physically robust, physically able to continuously play at a high level.
Because I don't think I see that. I mean, this is just my perspective. I know it's going off track, but I don't think I see that necessarily from the boys' side. I don't necessarily see that. I understand that they might. I don't think I see that they're not able to play like that for an extended period of time. I think I might see that they don't play as physically. But whereas with the girls, I see that they break down a bit more and they're not able to kind of...
I think, well, actually, interestingly, over this summer, we've not had as many injuries as we normally have. I haven't got any stats I can give you, I'm afraid, but the question that comes to me is if our injury rate hasn't been as high this summer, is something working? And now that's only injury rates, and that's not necessarily looking at sort of physicality on the court, but I don't know. And I think...
There's a lot of caveats to that as well, isn't there? Because programs might not have been as long, they might not have had as many times.
Yeah.
They might not have had as many pre-tournament games. But we do, what is essence is we need to track and monitor.
And we've got some tracking and monitoring research that hopefully is going to kick off in the next few months. And then on top of that as well, Ness, the robust pillar of the performance pillars that BE have put together will give a lot more education around strength and conditioning, and we're hopefully sort of trying to push that at the age group of 10, 12 with the Aspire program, and then that should hopefully feed through. But it needs addressing. Hopefully it's getting addressing slowly, but the outcomes of it won't be seen potentially for a wee while yet. I'm very conscious of time. All I'd like to sort of, I personally see, I know we touched an awful lot on loading because I actually think it's a really important area that we all need to be aware of, and whether we're educating ourselves as sort of other members of staff, or whether we can disseminate that information to parents, players, etc. I think it's a really important area to realise. But in terms of the use of the SSM as coaching staff, it'd be brilliant for you guys to be able to link in with physios, strength and conditioning coaches, potentially the doc, because you know if someone's shot is going off and they're not making their free throws all the time, is that something to do with the fact that their Achilles tendon has flared up and they're really struggling to then push through the legs because they're in pain? You know, and those sort of conversations don't always come out until you actually sit down with someone and say, look at the stats on this player, and then the physio might turn around and go, well, actually, he or she's playing with quite a bit of pain. So I think that's just an example of where the synergy can lie, really. Any questions? Any questions before we go for lunch? Well, feel free to bug me if you need any.